with his disciples one day, or actually his disciples were off in the distance a little bit, and he was sitting down watching. And he did this from time to time, but this time was quite significant. He was sitting down. I'm not going to sit down on the ground because he might miss me. I think I'm going to sit down on the ground because that hurts too much. And he says to his disciples, hey, come over here, come over here. And in the times, we're in Mark chapter 12, 41-ish, if you want to grab a Bible, but in the times in Mark when Jesus says that to his disciples, it's a significant moment. When he says, come here, I want to show you something, or I want to talk to you about something, it's always a significant moment, always, always. And so they come to his excited voice because he's just seen something. And the conversation goes something like this: what do you want, Jesus? And he said, look, can you see what I'm looking at? And the disciple says, what are you looking at over there? Sorry if I'm pointing at you, it's not you, but what are you looking at over there? I don't see anything happening. Look at the lady. What lady? We can't even see a lady over there. You mean the one in the rags? Yeah, look what she's done. It's filling my heart with joy. That's Mark chapter 12. Look what she's done. She came up. I've just seen what she's put in the treasury. Well, what did she put in the treasury? Did she give her estate? Did she give her will? Did she give everything? And Jesus said, yep, she did. She gave everything. It was 2 teeny tiny coins. 2 teeny tiny coins. And the disciple says, well, what's the big deal? And he says, well, do you know what? I've been sitting here. I've been sitting and watching people give. He does that now too. It might make you feel uncomfortable. I've been sitting and watching people give, and these rich guys have been coming in, and they've been making a show of it. They've been just dumping their money in, making it jingle, making it jangle, doing what they do. But this lady is so different. Look in Mark chapter 12, verse 42. 41, let's read. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd put their money into the temple treasury. So there's lots of rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor, listen to the story get really descriptive here. The writer here, the Holy Spirit inspiring Mark, is wanting us to slow down and look. But only one, she was poor, she was a widow, and she actually came into the temple, and she actually placed in, she's not throwing in, 2 very small copper coins, and here's their value, only a few cents. Got no idea what they'd be worth in today's society, maybe 10 cents, maybe less, probably less. And then he calls his disciples to him, and Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. She gave it all. For Israel, when they put in their money into the treasury, because Jesus was in Israel at this time, he was born in Israel, he lived most of his life in Israel. When they put their money into the treasury at the temple, that was their social welfare giving as well. That was their welfare giving to give out to the poor, to feed the priests, to feed all those people that worked in the temple. And it was also their act of worship. So it was a tax system as well as a worship system. And these rich guys were putting in so much. There's so much that I want you to learn from this, and I want you to think about. I struggle with some of it myself to understand, man, she gave all she had to live on. Does that mean I have to do the same? Does that mean I break the news to Laura, who just introduced me, my wife, and say, Laura, no dinner tonight. We've just given the whole lot away. Enjoy walking home. You walked here, but enjoy walking home. We have no cars left. We have nothing left. Actually, there's no home. I've given it all away. Is that what Jesus is calling us to do? What he's doing is a contrast between these rich guys that bookend, that are both sides of the story if you read Mark chapter 12's context. One of them is these rich lawgivers at the start that says that they devour widows or widows' houses, it might be. They devour, they scoff them up, they eat them. That's not they eat them physically, but they use up all their money instead of their own. And then the story after, the disciples are not even getting it because they're going, look at the temple, look how glorious it is, look at how magnificent it is. But Jesus says here, I want to tell you my heart. And my heart is for people who give extravagantly. This lady gave all she had to live on. It's not necessarily what we have to do, but she gave extravagantly. I want to tell you from this that we can see that God's values are totally different. Totally different. The thinking in the nation and the thinking in many of our churches in New Zealand and around the world is that if we're good Christians, God will bless us. God will make us healthy and wealthy. That's the stories that come out. That's the message that we hear. Not only that, but that's the message that we believe, even if we don't hear it in our church. Oh, this amazing boss and his wife, she was amazing too, and she said, man, we've never given so much money in all of our work lives. They gave and gave and gave to God's work, and she said, but we've never been so poor. And she expected, like I do, like others do, that if I'm giving and if I'm obedient to God, then I'll be rich and wealthy. Well, this woman's giving everything, all she had to live on, and she's poor. And these rich people are giving less in comparison, and they're rich. God's standards aren't our standards. When we look at the characters of the Bible, they often lived in a poor state, particularly in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you've got Moses. In the New Testament, you've got Peter. You've got John. You've got Paul living in poverty most of the time. Paul all the time. Jesus lived in a very poor state, not often having a place to even stay. He didn't even own a house. He lived it tough, but he came here like Andy talked about and prayed about so that he could give his life for us so that we could live with him. That's what he came for. He came to give everything. And so I've got a little question in my notes that I've written that says, if God wants us so wealthy, then why were his followers so poor? His standards are totally different. In fact, the Bible talks about in James and in other places that money is so dangerous because it takes away your dependency on God. Be careful trying to make lots. It's actually what we go out and do most days, isn't it? A lot of us. We go out to make money, but actually money is dangerous. It's not all about getting ahead. God's values are different than ours. And it takes a lot to learn that, and so you've got to hear it again and again, as these disciples did. Not only are God's values different than ours, but God sees. God sees what's going on. Jesus was looking at the temple and he was watching what was going on with the woman. He knew her poverty. And I would take from that we don't need to worry that if our kindness is seen or unseen. We don't need to worry that if our giving is seen or unseen. God sees. We don't have to worry if our poverty is seen or unseen. God sees. And he has promised that he would provide. He has promised that he would care. I totally, fully believe that he would have cared for that widow at that moment and fed and clothed and rewarded her with his treasury. There's one other little point before we go to apply this, and that is that we get to learn to live with injustice. This woman had to learn to live with injustice. I want to encourage that of this church community today. Not everything is fair, not everything is right, not everything is even. And we have to learn with that, learn to live with that. She doesn't hold back saying, look, it's someone else's responsibility to give. Let those rich guys give. My money doesn't mean anything. She says, no, I'm going to give everything I can and more. For Christians, justice often comes later. And that's what we look forward to. Justice comes later when the Lord returns. I want to pause right now and just ask you, and take some time. Who do you relate to in this story? You can't all say, I relate to Jesus. Do you relate to the poor person or the rich person? Or the rich people, the wealthy people? Well, my circumstances are far closer to the wealthy people than the poor people. Gosh, they might even exceed the wealthy people. Many of you would be the same. Well, what do we do in this situation? What do we do? Well, we become like Jesus and we care for the poor. I believe if this woman was in our church today, she wouldn't fit in. She would smell, probably. She would probably be poorly dressed, probably poor health. They didn't have a social welfare system, so for this woman to get her food, there was no pension coming every week. When she put her 2 small coins in, she wasn't thinking, well, I'm going to get my pension later in the week and I'll be right. She had no food. She had no husband to look after her to go and get the food. If the country was working well, then there'd be food on the roadside from the farmers leaving it there that she could go and work and get, but she had to use physical labour to do that. It wasn't just lying in a roadside store. That's God's system. That's how He set it up. She was dependent on other people to take care for her. But if she was sitting in here, she'd probably be in poor health, poorly dressed, not smelling the best. And if she was in the habit of giving God her best, she would likely be wearing rags. It took me a while to choose which of my 10 pairs of shoes I was going to wear this morning that would fit at church. She probably had 1 pair of shoes, 1 item of clothing. Society would probably say of her, and perhaps we would as we look at her, and I know that most people in this room would look at her with kindness and talk to her and smile at her and offer her coffee, but society would say to her, there's not much to her. There's not much worth. But for her, she made God smile. She made God smile. We should care for people. We should care for people that make God smile. God's system, as I said, in the nation of Israel was set up to care for the poor by giving them work to do, to letting them work for their food. We're supposed to care for the poor. One of my daughters and I recently went to Auckland, and we were walking down the streets of Auckland late at night. In the dark anyway, and every second shop had a beggar outside the shop. And I see it in Taupo quite a lot, and I drive around with one of our policemen from here, and at night time we see the odd poor person, and he educates me about how a Christian should approach that. On my first night driving around with him, he said to me, Andrew, they're partly your fault. They're partly my fault that they're living on the street because I'm not looking after them. He says, no, because they come to you and ask for money and you give it to them. Don't do that. It doesn't help. In the nation of Israel, when you saw a poor person, you were to give them from your field, the edges of your field. You weren't going to go and just give them coins so they could go and spend whatever they want. So if I see a poor person in town and I'm feeling generous, I say, look, I've got some food for you. You'll just have to wait for 5 minutes and I'll go and get it and I'll go and bring it back. And so I come down to church and I help myself to the cupboards, and then I come back and the poor person's gone. We have to be careful what we do with them, but we have to be kind. We have to be kind. There's one way that we do care for the poor in New Zealand, and that's by paying our taxes. And I know some Christians that work really hard not to pay taxes, and I'd encourage you, pay your taxes. Can you just do that pause thing, Vaughan, that we talked about?